Hello and welcome to today's CDCT live session. I'm your host, Jason Rader from Insight's Cloud and Data Center Transformation Division. Our topic today is your governance strategy cloud ready? And joining me today is Scott Cameron, who's our cloud services lead in CDCT's consulting services. Welcome, Scott.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Happy to be talking to you this morning.
Yeah, likewise. So, to kind of level the playing field, if you will, let's start off by talking about what we're talking about when we say governance strategy.
So governance has a couple different connotations in my experience. You have one that's more about GRC, where you've got regulatory and compliance and more of the security posture. The other one is more about the basic foundation, building the healthy foundation of policy enforcement, best practices, and frameworks that's necessary to design a solution that grows healthily with the company over time.
Got you. So not saying that one is more important than the other. It takes both of those, the GRC side as well as this side, to be successful, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. You need to be looking at both the security requirements as well as the requirements of the business on just how they want to manage and report and how they want to consume over time. Oftentimes our customers go and dive into cloud head first, which is fantastic. But they may not do all of the prep work ahead of time, and it ends up getting them into trouble sometimes. Not that you can't dig out of it, you just have to spend a little bit more time on it. If you don't do some of that up front.
Right, and I think you're probably being kind saying sometimes it gets them into trouble. We've got some experience with clients, and the majority of them, and again, cloud was one of those things that a lot of people embraced early because they saw their ability to go to market quicker and to realize a customer base that maybe they weren't able to get to. There were lots of good things about cloud, and a lot of people jumped on that those capabilities and elasticity capabilities and those flexibility. But it was one of those things, as everything is, where if you go in without thinking about these other things on this side of the house, you run into trouble.
Yeah, this is pretty common. I'll give you, one case. We had a customer who had acquired other companies, and they had multiple environments that they were trying to integrate that were all separate. They were managed separately, different tenants, different accounts, different policies. And many of the consumers of the cloud platforms were people that, the technology management in IT didn't even know who, these applications belong to. And, why is this thing configured to, consume $10,000 a month? It was a fairly large effort for them to go back and integrate those environments, consolidate them, optimize them, do some automation. But when they did, they had a 30% or more decrease in their cloud spend. And probably more importantly than the decreased cloud spend was the decrease in overall complexity and the management required to troubleshoot issues when they came up. It's so hard to support something that's large and complex like that, if you can simplify it, you're going to get some additional labor savings in the overall management and care and feeding.
Awesome. So when we're talking about, you mentioned consolidate. What kinds of things are we talking about consolidating? Is it just the tenants and subscriptions? What other kinds of things?
Well, they're called different things on different platforms, right? You've got Amazon, and you've got Microsoft and Google and Oracle. They all have fairly similar types of structures to facilitate the policy design and enforcement on the platform. And oftentimes it's just a matter of turning these on and doing some minimal configuration to get the benefit out of them. But so many customers don't even know that they exist because they just don't know the platforms yet. So that's kind of the trick, is making sure that you're leveraging the tools that are available to you on the platform, both for the structure of your governance. So that might be accounts or tenants at the top level, or it might be resource groups or environments, or whatever the terminology is, and then making sure that you're leveraging management groups to be able to apply policy across multiple different subscriptions and resource groups. And when you do that and you enforce things like tagging, then you're able to turn on cost management features on the platforms and use those to identify additional opportunities to govern and to reduce cost.
Wow, that was a lot of stuff. I want to come back to a few things in there, but I mean, so you've established the fact that there's a lot of stuff going on, potentially, right? And then people are looking back at, how do we govern this thing? And that's always, a fun thing to go back and do after kind of the cat's out of the bag, if you will, from a cloud perspective.
Mm-hmm.
What's the approach to kind of reel all this stuff back in?
Well, oftentimes what we do is we help customers do, I'll call it a health check, a design review. We'll look at what they have right now, how they're consuming, what kinds of features they've turned on. We'll look at the governance that they have set up, and then we'll compare that to the best practices in a framework. There are frameworks available from all the vendors. They generally call them a cloud adoption framework, but there are third-party frameworks for managing cloud and information technology, from ITIL to the open source TOGAF and different ones. And what we'll generally do is we will review the current state of the customer. We'll look at the best practice from a framework. We'll customize the framework a little bit for them, and then we'll do a gap analysis and then help them get to, that better place that they would like to be once we've used some of those standards and best practices.
Understood. So a very programmatic approach. This wasn't something that we accidentally, or an organization will accidentally fall backwards into, or just figure out on a Friday over lunch. This is something that's got to involve many areas of the organization in a full program.
It's intentional. You have to intentionally design in a way that leverages some standards. If you don't have standards, then you don't have a good way to track how you're performing against those standards. You've got to do the baseline and make sure that the baseline is healthy before you start growing on top of it, so that you can understand, where your starting point was, and that lets you help, define the journey to where you want to go.
Got it. And you talked about a little bit of, cost was one of the things that you talked about, budget versus reality. What are some of the, I think we both shared a couple of, maybe we could call them horror stories related to folks in the surprise. What are some of the things you've seen related to that when you're working with clients, that maybe had them call you in at that point?
Yeah, so I had one customer who had planned to have $5,000 to $10,000 a month in cloud spend, and they came to us with over 10 times that. This was because they had purchased another company, and they had not done any of the good work of integrating those and consolidating and optimizing. For them, it was just, conceptually a big leap to go from, I've got to spend, say $30,000 on physical IT equipment, if I'm going to renew this every 3 or 4 years, to I'm going to spend $10,000 a month on IT. So really the expectations of the business on what cloud would look like and the spend would look like were perhaps unrealistic. and IT wasn't able to, in any kind of efficient way, tell IT what to expect. They didn't know how to budget because they didn't know how to budget.
Yep. I think it's funny. We look at the percentage or the 0.00, however many cents something costs when we're looking at the overall cost of going, doing infrastructure as a service, for example. And it looks like so minuscule, like how could it add up to $100,000 a month? But, you instantiate a bunch of virtual servers and storage and leave them on. And especially if you're doing development or those kinds of things, and that bill adds up.
Yeah, it's easy to consume more than you planned if you don't turn on some of the basic features. When, for instance, in Azure, and I imagine it's the same in AWS and GCP, when you provision a virtual machine, there's a page there where you can put specifically, I want to turn this off at 5 p.m. And if you do that, then you aren't paying for the compute related to that workload when you're not using it. Something as simple as that can save you, 40, 50, 80%, depending on how you're going to use that resource. And as you are using it less and as you are maturing your use of cloud, the amount of administration that you need to perform on it decreases. So in that way, you've got some governance around how you're consuming cloud that is helping you obtain more value from cloud. Because you can really get value two ways. You can either increase your ability, that's your ability to deploy and manage infrastructure and getting additional capabilities out of the cloud. Things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, those things. Or you can decrease cost. So if you want to make sure you're getting the most value from the platform, you've really got to pull both of those levers. You have to get more capability out of the platform, which may require you to invest more in the platform. And then you have to also look at how you can reduce costs.
That brings up an interesting question. So are all the platforms created equally when we're talking about this?
They have very similar capabilities. They're not necessarily all the same. There are cost management features in each of them, and there are governance structures in each of them. The ability to create templates and blueprints and those kinds of things, applying policy and quotas and enforcing tagging. All of these things exist on all of the platforms. They call them something a little bit different, but it's really a big game of keeping up with the Joneses for the cloud platforms. When one develops a new capability, a feature that customers are demanding, it gets developed on the other ones as well. And really, the differences are in how the services are packaged and what the naming is, really more than having different features.
No, I agree the same way. It's typically universal, regardless whether we're talking about cloud or other hardware platforms. Once somebody has this kind of killer aspect, it's not looking for an acquisition will occur or that feature's built into the other side. So it's not a reason to migrate from one platform to the other. That's interesting.
Yeah, not generally. And there's another layer of governance that you can do when you've got multiple clouds. And that's maybe something that's worth talking to also. Cloud management platforms definitely have their place when our customers have multiple large and complex investments in public cloud platforms, if they're both using AWS and Azure. But the thing they have to consider before they implement a cloud management platform is, if I implement this cloud management platform, am I going to be able to get out of the day-to-day management of the underlying platforms? Or am I just adding a third platform that I now need to have additional administrative capability across? And then I'm still going to need to go dig down into individual platforms. So you really have to have a use case there to justify that additional capability. And maybe there's a killer governance capability that lets you apply a single policy across multiple clouds that you've just got to have for some sort of compliance reason. Okay, great. That might be a defining characteristic of needing a cloud management platform. But just make sure you have someone available to actually go do the administration of that cloud platform and the cloud management product.
Right. I think a lot of people want the Ronco rotisserie grill, if you will, to set it and forget it. And that doesn't happen regardless of how easy it seems to be by using the cloud or the management platforms.
Yeah, not when you're doing DIY. Certainly there is, the option to leverage managed services. We do this often for our customers where, they tell us the business requirements, what their, governance requirements are, what regulations they're having to adhere to. And then they say, you manage it for us and make sure that we are adhering to those best practices and standards. So that is something that you can do. There is a cost associated with it, but it may offset the cost that you would incur in doing it on your own.
No, I think that's interesting because same goes on a security side. It's one of those things where, if you don't have the resources to be able to manage this level, outsource that to somebody else. And then when it escalates to a certain level, it comes back and your internal management team would handle that. But I think to your earlier point, outsourcing or having somebody manage your cloud management, if you will, doesn't fix your governance problem necessarily because they're going to manage it in the way that you've told them to.
That's right. Unless you do the good work up front in defining what those standards and policy are, just handing it off to someone else is not going to magically make it better. It may give you more consistent reporting and support, but it's not necessarily going to fix the underlying problem. So, what we generally recommend is that our customers go through a remediation effort of some sort ahead of time. And then that way, when they move into management ongoing, they're in a healthy state that can be maintained rather than trying to dig out of a hole, of technology debt.
Yeah. So you mentioned a term earlier that I wanted to come back to that it seems to be the focus of a lot of conversations that we're having with clients. You have said tagging at least twice during our conversation. Can you explain what tagging is?
Well, yeah, just if you take a social media example, you associate hashtags with posts that you make on social media. Well, when you deploy a service on a cloud platform, you assign keywords to that resource that let you then go do reporting against it. If you go to Twitter or LinkedIn or wherever, you might click on a hashtag and see everything related to that hashtag. On the cloud platform, you might define keywords based on the group that owns it, whoever the application architect was, a variety of different things. That'll let you then go perform cost management, functions, do show back and charge back into the organization. Look at all of a certain type of resource together. It really facilitates that healthy ongoing management of the platform.
No, I think that's great. And, from that aspect, I think tagging is one of those things that a lot of people, if you didn't do it to begin with, you've got to dig yourself out of that, to be able to leverage it the way that you want to. And it's the same from a data perspective when we're talking about security. It's, data classification and figuring out the different types that you need, and then actually going out and identifying where those things reside and actually getting the tags associated with those data types. After you go through that exercise, you're really no better than you were before at that exact moment. It's moving forward. Your management and control and governance of those assets is significantly better. It's worth the investment, but it's way easier, as to your point earlier, to do that on the front end rather than the back end.
Yeah, you get the real value on the back end after you've done the work through that additional capability to report and manage. Sometimes it's a little bit painful to get there, but you can enforce that tagging, and you can enforce the format of the tagging in the cloud platform as well, so that you don't have 4 different development groups doing their own thing, none of which are capable of being reported on at the same time. So that's really where centralized IT management comes into the plan here. Is you've got to define what those standards are for the organization. Here's how we're going to do tagging. Here's an example I like to give to customers. Yeah, if you have an on-premises data center or server room, whatever, who is going to define the manufacturer and model of servers that you're going to rack? Who's going to define the standards around what switches and routers you're going to use? Are you going to let the consumers of the technology define the standards for you, or are
It's
you
HR, right?
Yeah, are you going to define them centrally? Well, it's no different when you go to the cloud. Just because it's easier for you to hand over the keys to, consumers of the platform, doesn't mean that you should just do that lock, stock, and barrel and trust that they are going to follow best practices. You have to make sure that they do.
That's a great point. And almost every conversation that we talk about this, cloud in general or cloud platforms or hybrid, we talk about that consumer aspect. I think, and the kind of the shift is to understand, in general, understand your audience or understand who is actually consuming. So from an organization's perspective, to understand the way that these guys want to consume and access it, but then also from a governance perspective, who really needs to kind of be very prescriptive or govern how these guys access and consume those resources.
Yeah, it's important to define who the stakeholders are. Oftentimes, the stakeholders are the business. It might be the CFO is one of the stakeholders because it's an operational expense when you move to the cloud and you start consuming that way. And budgeting is going to be incredibly challenging for those who have been used to only, capital investments in the past, because it looks different when you move to the cloud. Are you still paying for operating system licenses, every 3 or 4 years on a license agreement, or is the cost of that operating system embedded in the cost of the resource you provisioned on the cloud platform? Simple things like that can be a huge wholesale change for organizations that have invested heavily in on-premises technologies. And that's just one area.
Yeah. I mean, transformation's in our name, right? So I think when we're talking about this transformation that happens, there seems to be a large people aspect to when we're talking about governance. It's not just a technology play.
You're absolutely right. The best tools in the world only get you as far as those who are wielding the tools. When you start transforming from an on-premises data center world to a cloud world, you need to understand how the IT management principles and concepts that you've leveraged, on-premises translate to the cloud. Managing, and you're probably better aware of this than most, managing security infrastructure on premises, firewalls, routers, SEIMs, those things is not necessarily the same on premises as it is in the cloud. And if you take those same cloud principles, or those same principles used on premises, and try to apply them to cloud without understanding how it's different in the cloud, then you're going to fail in how you're consuming cloud. You're not going to be getting the most value, the best functionality, whatever, out of the platforms.
So I like to give folks that listen to these, and and hello everybody out there listening, some gold nuggets, if you will. We're professionals. We do this a lot. If they were going to undertake these types of endeavors on their own, where do they start?
So there's a couple. I like to say that a cloud architecture board or a cloud architect is going to be really important for organizations to designate. Someone needs to be, someone person or a board of people needs to be responsible for evaluating how an organization is going to move to the cloud. And that's just because you can't manage by committee. If you give the ability to manage independent environments out to different portions of the business, then you lose the capability to ensure that the company's overall goals are accomplished in a way that makes sense. You can't have too many cooks in the kitchen. Someone's got to be responsible. So that's a big one up front. Define a cloud architecture board or a cloud architect that's going to be the main stakeholder. But then get the rest of the business involved in a way that makes sense. Make sure the CIO and CTO and CFO are on board, and maybe that's where you have the board rather than just the architect. Is you've got some of these other people who are invested in the transformation. As well as the people who are the technology leaders in actually going and deploying technology. And then that's also somewhere that partners can fit in, is participating in a board like that to make sure that to help customers understand that there are some best practices that you've developed over time, and how they might relate to that particular customer. So that's a big one. Let me think of a.
Well, while you're thinking about that, I think one of the important things, again, back to that transformational conversation that we were having earlier, is that there's a transformation that probably has to take place from a people perspective on that architecture board, because they're probably going to have to interact in a way that they haven't interacted before. I see a lot of organizations, and I say this every time, that we've gotten so big and they've kind of fallen into their little areas, IT, information security, all the different layers that happen in an organization and development. Now, when we're talking about cloud, there's a different level of communication that's got to take place. It can't be the way that it always has been. If you do what you've always done, you're going to get what you've always gotten, right? So I think that is one of those things where, from a partner perspective, where we've come in a lot of places, is really to be that facilitator, show the best practices. Again, is, hey, you guys all work together, you're going to get a way better result. And that's nothing could be more important when we're talking about governance related to this.
Yeah, there's a lot of organizational change management that needs to occur when you start looking at adopting additional platforms for providing technology services. And it just it makes a big difference in how you're thinking about cloud. Is this something that's going to get us something, or is it something that I'm scared of? And if I'm scared of it and I don't want to learn it, then it's going to be a challenge when I go to transform. So really, you've got to make sure that you've got people on board. They understand what's changing, how it's going to affect them, so that they don't get scared that their job isn't going to be there after they move to cloud. And that's generally not the case for our customers.
Agreed.
What it allows their technology people to do is to become more strategic and think more about ways to provide value to the business and less about just keeping the lights on.
I couldn't agree with you more. Things are going to change, but it's going to be okay.
Yeah. And, sometimes our customers just need permission. They need permission. They need to know it's going to be okay. There are ways to do all the things that you want to do to make sure that the controls are in place so that you can be comfortable with this as a way forward for the organization. Because when you get right down to it, this becomes the foundation of future capabilities that really help you redefine how your organization is going to interact with your customers. Being able to leverage technologies like machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language search, those things all become possible without doing all of the hard work of developing the capability once you get invested in a cloud platform in the right way. So that's when you really start pulling that second lever. I talked earlier about having two levers where you've got one that's cost management or reducing cost, and the other one is increasing capability. When you start increasing capability, you really start differentiating yourself against your competitors, and building net new capabilities. May generate more revenue, or it may increase customer sat, or any number of other things.
And I think, on that same topic, you talked about, in our brief earlier, you talked about continuous innovation, another thing that has to be considered when we're talking about this.
Well, yeah, cloud changes so quickly. Both the governance of the cloud, as new structures are added and capabilities are created for creating templates and blueprints and enforcing standards, policy, tagging, those kinds of things. So as the capabilities of the cloud platforms change, if you're not moving to leverage those new capabilities, you're falling into the same trap that you're in now, where you've got on-premises technology that you invest in for 4 years at a time, and then you're stuck with it for 4 years, and you don't get to leverage the new capabilities until you update. Well, in the cloud, it moves much, much faster. You get new capabilities in many cases on a weekly or even daily basis. And if you're not continuously reviewing how you're consuming the platform and then how you're managing the platform, you are not getting the most value out of that platform. And you may actually be handicapping yourself when you're starting to move into the future and trying to provide new features and functionality and capabilities. You've got to keep your eye on the ball, and you've got to keep on innovating, because that's how you maximize the value of cloud.
And I love that. People get overwhelmed by it, but I think it's, you don't have to, but you're really missing an opportunity if you don't think about the platform and what it can offer. From my perspective, I've got teams and we're using really new technology in general, but there are new features that come out sometimes, like you said, every day. And people get kind of wrapped around the axle when the console changes. And, well, I used to click here and now I have to click here, or it's in a totally other, they've consolidated consoles, which is a good thing in general. But the fact that they had to change the way that they did things, people don't like change. And to your point earlier, change is going to happen, but it's okay. We're going to survive this. You reminded me of a situation like I went ziplining recently for my birthday. And ziplining is, you're putting your life in danger to a certain degree. You've got equipment, which I understand the rating of the equipment. I understand, took the class. They told me what to do. But it was funny, that whole, we give permission to people because we've done this before. It all boiled down to, I'm hooked in. I looked over at a person who was much, much younger than me. And he looked at me and was like, go ahead. And I was like, right on. Now I'm going to jump off of this platform and go for it because this guy told me it was okay and I trusted him. And I had a fantastic time. But, I could have not taken his advice and sat there and not had that experience that I was looking for.
Yeah, it's interesting. Your day job still needs to get done when you move to the cloud. It's not like that just stops. And having experts alongside you, like you did when you were ziplining, who are able to say, yes, you're doing it right, you're going to be okay, I promise, here's how it works. Those kinds of things is really important. And you don't necessarily need to develop all of that on your own. Your business is doing business. It's not necessarily providing IT services. So that's where bringing in some help periodically may help. Our customers make sure that they're getting the most value over time. And that might just look like something like where every quarter you have someone come in and say, here's what's changed, here's what I know about how you're doing things, and here are some things that you should consider going forward. You're doing this thing, maybe that's changed a little bit and you should change it. You're looking at doing these new things in the quarter ahead, and here's some suggestions about services that are coming out that you might consider to do this for you. Just having that periodic over time investment from an expert can really make a difference to organizations.
No, and I think that's a fantastic final thought. That kind of Sherpa or guide to that cloud journey is hugely important. And that's something, again, folks like us, we get to maximize that over, that investment that we've made in understanding the ever-changing environments and the interactions between the multiple platforms and those things. We get to maximize that investment that we've made over and over with the different folks that we serve. Whereas an organization that is, not in the business of what we are in the business of, they don't get to, leverage that investment more than the one time that they use it. Or maybe they've done all the investment to see what the platform can provide, and they're not going to even utilize that capability. But I think that, maximizing your capabilities or the features that are available to you is a great place that I'd like to end. Scott, any final words for the folks listening?
I would urge anybody who's beginning the cloud journey to make sure that you do the upfront work on designing your governance, your foundation, your landing zone, whatever you're going to call it, and make sure that you are comfortable with how you grow inside of the platforms that you're investing in over time. Look at your existing reporting requirements and your governance requirements and the regulations you adhere to, and then ensure that not just one part of your organization, but your whole organization is committed to leveraging those concepts as you move into the cloud, and make sure that the design supports being able to do so. That's really the biggest recommendation I have, because it costs more to implement that kind of governance and controls later if you have to go back and remediate challenges than it does to just do the work up front. Do the hard work first.
I love it. Scott Cameron, thank you so very much for your time today. And for all of you guys who would like some additional information, we have a plethora at our website at insightcdct.com. Hope to see you next time. Have a good day.
Thanks, everybody.